Thank you, Alan, and a very good morning to everyone. I think from the discussion yesterday, I found it quite interesting because we're talking about efficiency and resilience. We're talking about sustainability and resilience and the role of technology, so on and so forth. And today I'll share with you some of the insights I was able to gather going through the literature to look at this issue of collaboration in supply chain management. I must admit, when I received the brief and I saw the scope of the abstract, I was a bit scared because it had many things in it. There was collaboration, there was alliances, there was keywords such as crowdsourcing, Gainsharing. So I was saying to myself, okay, so how am I going to approach this, and how I could share, what I would find when doing the literature search. So from that start, I started thinking, and this is how my presentation will look like, where I will first of all, go through a very basic introduction, but then really looking into some of the key drivers behind supply chain collaboration. And one thing that I've noticed is that when we talk about supply chain collaboration, very often there's a big question mark in terms. Okay, we talk about collaborating, but what's the extent of the collaboration? What type of levels are we actually talking about? I think that's still a big question mark. Then, yes, I'll go into the supply chain collaboration resilience. And this is where it's very interesting because with all this new technology coming in, and we've heard quite a lot, the exchange of information, it's becoming, in a sense, easier. But then, from the discussion yesterday, it's still not that easy to be able to access information. One of the things that I say very often when I work in my region of the world is that in terms of the know-how, the method, I think that it's similar around the world. But really the key part is the know-who. Who do you know to get access to the information? So this is why it is very important, I think especially for academia, to be very much involved with the private sector organization, to be involved with the governments, because we're not doing business. So we could act as a kind of a go-between between these various interest groups and then try to come up with something that could be of interest. And then I'll finish off with a public-private collaboration, an example, a case in a humanitarian setting, because as you know, in 2011, Thailand, almost a third of the country, we were flooded, and I still remember my mother taking her safe with all her jewelry out of the house. So it was a very interesting time for us, where we didn't even know if our house was going to be flooded or not. We went to the seaside for 2 weeks, and then the water didn't come, so we went back, and then the water came. So it was a bit crazy. And then maybe some of the lessons learned that I've had from going through this particular research. So in terms of the introduction, I think we're all very familiar with this, is that yes, supply chains are becoming more global, but one thing is they are becoming much more fragile. And I think what Martin has said yesterday, it's very true. There's a lot of risk involved, fragility involved in the supply chain itself. And then when we think in terms of collaboration, you basically have this concept where, well, traditionally you would look at it from the perspective of a plan and execute. So that means there's a central planning, maybe from the headquarters, and then trying to deploy the execution of the planning to the various partners. But that's quite rigid. Whereas the direction seems to be to go to a kind of a sense and respond way. So that means you're trying to assess what is happening, trying to think, forecast sometime what might happen, and then try to find the best way of responding to that. But in order to be able to respond, one of the key issues is that you need to be able to have visibility, and you need to be able to see what is happening, between your various supply chain partners, so that then you can respond better and then make up that resilience. supply chain. So really, one of the key condition is speed. The speed of information needs to be very rapid between the supply chain member. One of the things that I've noticed is we tend to say, yes, information needs to flow very quickly, but we don't say enough in terms of what is the exact information. We don't say enough. I haven't really seen it that much in the literature, but it's usually very generic. Yes, the information needs to flow. It must be uninterrupted within the supply chain. So, yeah, these are some of the key words. But then, when we talk about collaboration, usually collaboration and resilience, I think, came slightly later. Initially, collaboration was really more in terms of how then in the supply chain could become more competitive and hopefully sustainable. So in this presentation, and like I've said, it's quite interesting because the scope is very wide. So first one, of course, how collaboration between stakeholders and establishment of alliances can help make supply chain more resilient. So this is what I'm supposed to look at. Then the innovative ways to operate the supply chain and if they can reinforce the resiliency. And then the public-private partnership. So this really helped me to try to focus in terms of trying to answer these three questions in my draft. So let's look at the drivers of collaboration. So normally when you have collaboration, and from the literature, this is what usually happens, the consequence of collaboration. There is one dimension where you collaborate, then it impacts the efficiency. And we had quite a large discussion yesterday related to that. So, cost reduction, reduce inventory, shorten lead time. But then another consequence is also effectiveness. Because you're collaborating, then, your customer service of the chain has improved, market shares have grown, and you are able to make more revenue. And if you're able to make more revenue, well, what should follow is you should have more profitability. But what I have also found out when going through the literature is that in some of the manuscript, in some of the papers, now they're talking about collaboration as a part of a kind of a risk mitigation strategy. So I think this is something that is important, is that it doesn't just look at, yes, efficiency, effectiveness, but collaboration can be considered as part of a risk mitigation strategy. However, there is still quite a lot of gap between the theory, what we find in the literature, and what is actually happening in the real world. And when we read a lot of the papers, we mostly have like good examples of how they are working. We don't have a lot of papers, or I haven't seen a lot of papers where we talk about things that have not really worked when the collaboration wasn't successful. So this is why I put in, tends to be in better shape than in reality. But then when you look at in terms of collaboration, this is what the literature have said to me, is that, well, if you want to collaborate, there's a number of things that you need to have. Yes, the first one is the information, but information is just a starting point. I think what is very important when you want to collaborate is trust. And that is a big question when we look at supply chain management. How much do you trust your supply chain partners? And because of the different level of sizes, the bargaining power that is very different, it does create some challenges. And when you're starting to work together, yes, coordination, planning needs to be done together, but also you need to be aware that you have both a win-win situation, but the sharing of risk also will exist. And this mutual recognition of mutual interdependence, I find this very interesting, is that you need to be aware that you are part of a supply chain. Sometimes it is quite difficult for firms when you try to explain to them the supply chain, where are you in your supply chain? And I think I do agree with what Martin has said, is that in reality it's a network, it's a demand network, but when you use the term chain, then sometimes they're not very clear in terms of where they are exactly. And when we look at the definition, types, categories, you have a whole lot of of people writing, giving names to different ways on how you can collaborate. But just to summarize, in terms of the drivers, 5 key variables have been identified, in fact, for supply chain collaboration. So what are these variables? So what I've tried to do is I've tried to also put in a definition. So the first driver, yes, is trust. And the definition here is the degree to which supply chain partners has the intention and ability to work for the good of the chains. They're supposed to trust each other. Then the commitment, right? In the commitment, it's implicit, explicit pledge of relational continuity between exchange partners. Then the decision synchronization, when they're making joint decision, planning, operational context. And then the fourth one, it's also quite fascinating. It's the incentive alignment. The degree to which chain members share costs, risk, and benefit. And last but not the least, information sharing and this big discussion in the willingness to share the data. What type of data? Strategic, tactical data that can be made available to other members of the supply chain itself. So from then, when you look at the from these 5 key drivers, there was this interesting PhD thesis by a person by the name of Randall in 2012, where he really said, okay, collaborative relationships has been proposed as a key capability for enhancing supply chain resilience. So we're starting to see that we're moving, in fact, from just a collaboration, competitiveness, so on and so forth, moving into the resilience. And then, of course, Howley looked at the extent of supply chain collaboration, where he said, okay, it depends on a number of things, organizational, information, coordination, resource sharing. But what is interesting is this, in fact, if you're able to maintain and manage a good collaboration, a good relationship, then resources could also be better utilized. And one of the outcomes of a supply chain collaboration is to have the integrated supply chain. And I think this is where it's also interesting, because in the literature, there's also a lot of discussion on we need to integrate the supply chain. So, in fact, from collaboration, we move up to this area of the integrated supply chain, and this is a figure of the integrated supply chain, where really the key part is all about how do you manage all of these relationship, all of these flows of information, product, services, the funds, and the knowledges. And if we look at the levels of collaboration, this is what I can say is that the debate in the literature is not really about, full collaboration versus no collaboration, but it is really much more about how much collaboration, under which circumstances. I think this is where we need to be much more precise when we use the term collaboration, and sometimes we even see the word cooperation, coordination. So there's quite a few similar words, but with some different senses. And in fact, to answer this question, it depends very much on the nature, on the purpose of the supply chain itself. You don't need to have full collaboration all the time. It really depends on the dependency between the supplier, the customer. Maybe some people have proposed that collaboration works better when there is high demand and certainty. So, it is still not very clear. And I think this is maybe what is missing, some sort of a roadmap for collaboration. How do you actually do collaboration? But we talk a lot about collaboration. I think we like to talk about it, but I'm not very sure if we are really very clear in terms of how do we collaborate. And one of the key things when I'm in my country, in Thailand, I tend to say that supply chain management, supply chain collaboration is very difficult in Thailand. And I explain to them the example of, if you look at sports where Thai people are good, it's individual sports. It's boxing, that's where we're at the Olympics, or weightlifting. We're not good at team sport, and this is a team sport. But then I had this person say to me, that is not true. In Thailand, we're very good at a team sport. And that team sport is when politicians are corrupt, because they do not eat alone. So so we had this big discussion, and then I said to him, so what is a key success factor if you say that supply chain collaboration is successful? And at the end of the day, he said it's about the incentive, it's about the interest of each members being met. But of course, if you are a bigger member, you have more bargaining power, then yes, you will win more than those that have less bargaining power. So I think that was a very interesting discussion, and we had some members of parliament at that time talking with us, and they just left the room because they didn't want to hear what we had to say. So supply chain collaboration and resilience. This is interesting also. There was this paper where they looked at what type of collaboration would lead to what type of resilience. So it's not a one-on-one type of relation. I just tried to put them together where they say, okay, you need information sharing, collaborative communication, mutually created knowledge, joint relationship effort, and that will lead to visibility, velocity, and flexibility. So it means that, yes, when we look at collaboration, from third and authors, it does lead to resilience. But if you are really to summarize, is that the more you collaborate, in fact, what happens is that you are reducing uncertainties. When you're reducing uncertainties, well, it enhances the resilience because you're able to manage better. You know better what is happening. In terms of the exchange of information, and we had, I think, a very nice discussion on the new technology. And it's true, we have a lot of new business model. We have crowd shipping, which gives you a lot of information. You have real-time business intelligence, predictive analysis that is needed for decision making. But the key point is really this: is all the various firms in the supply chain must demonstrate the willingness to share information for the decision making. If you don't share, then you can have the best technology in the world. It doesn't help. It doesn't help. So the exchange of information is critical, but then you need to have other conditions. So when we talk about collaboration, and like I was saying, it's about this roadmap. How do we actually establish a roadmap for collaboration? And then from then on, if we're collaborating, then we should be more resilient. So how could we do that? Maybe one way of doing it is through this Gainsharing, vested outsourcing. It was quite interesting. I wasn't very familiar initially with the term, but it's about firms and the logistics service provider working together. They have a vested interest in each other's success so that they, both of them, achieve mutually created, desired outcome. So this is something that is quite, for me, relatively new. And then there's a difference between Gainsharing and vested outsourcing, but some of the researchers at the University of Tennessee were basically saying if it's vested outsourcing, at least the process is more visible and both parties are accountable to that relationship. But the most important part is this incentive alignment, because if the incentives are not aligned, then it becomes quite difficult to achieve the collaboration. So what are the key success factors? Well, the focus should be on the outcome itself. What do we want to achieve, not the transaction. Focus on the what you want to do, not on the how are you going to do it. When you agree on the outcome, they need to be measurable. They need to be defined. Need to optimize the pricing model for cost and service trade-off, and then insight, not oversight, governance structure. So that means, yes, you have an understanding, but you're not trying to tell them what or how they should do their job. And very interestingly enough, based on this vested outsourcing, the people at Tennessee did this kind of interesting case study on McDonald's, where they say, okay, rule one, focus on outcome and not transaction. So just trying to say, okay, how does McDonald's works in terms of building its business with its suppliers, and basically saying it's not a transactional relationship, it's a long-term relationship. Then two, focus on the what, not the how, is that you need to be able to work with your suppliers in order to achieve the outcome that you want to achieve. And then agree on these, define, measurable. So yes, you have food safety, quality, but you have a lot more than that. And then rule 4, pricing, again, it's about long-term sustainability, and then the govern for insight. So it's all about the sustainability at the end of the day, and not really forcing, telling each partner exactly what to do. So this is, I think, something quite interesting. I wasn't very familiar with initially, but yeah, it's all about looking at long-term and mutual benefits. Now let's look at public and private collaboration. I'll share with you a very quick humanitarian example. Why is it a humanitarian example? Maybe because, when you look at a humanitarian situation, it tends to be much, much more unstable and unpredictable. So more collaboration is needed, and it's in fact collaboration with not just between the partners, but with external agencies. You have to focus with the firm suppliers, but also with these public agencies, so that you're able to increase efficiency, effectiveness in the disaster response. And one thing that we have seen is that in the humanitarian field, this participatory approach is already in existence. I think it's already embedded from the beginning when they're looking at ways on how to design, on how to develop the relief processes. It's not just one organization doing it. It is based on a participatory approach. And I think this is one of the lessons learned for me, that when you look at private and public humanitarian supply chain, there is an initial philosophical difference in terms of how they are designed. But at the end of the day, it's supposed to give you a win-win outcome. So when you look at the continuum, strategic collaboration continuum, this is based on some of the work I did. In fact, initially looking at strategic philanthropy. So how firms through the CSR, and the observation that a lot of the work was very much ad hoc. And then if you had a strategy for philanthropy, that could be something interesting. And then we discovered this table from Austin, which we found very fascinating, because starting from good intention, yes, I want to come in and be a good corporate citizen, then going into actually supporting some of the activities, and then the last stage really working with the various partners in the humanitarian supply chain. So it shows that it can be an evolving thing, and it goes back to what I was referring to a few moments ago in terms of the roadmap for collaboration. So collaboration, in order to achieve resilience, I will share with you this case of Procter & Gamble, what they did in Thailand in 2011, where they donated water purifier. So it's a kind of a chemical. It's one of the irony: when you are flooded, you cannot drink the water that is around you. So you need to have a special chemical. And initially, for this product, Procter & Gamble, they wanted to sell it at the base of the pyramid, but they couldn't sell it. And so they had to change their whole approach. But I'm just using this case as an example of public-private collaboration and how it can enhance resiliency. So, objective of the case study is looking at framework, documents to lessons, and lessons learned for humanitarian relief for future reference. So these are some of the things that happen in my country, and it was very, very fascinating. Each of the governors had the responsibility of not having their area flooded. So what they would do is they would hijack trucks with sand so that the water would flow to the next province, but not their province. So it didn't really help a lot, but at least their KPI were met. So I think, again, what was missing was really this overall picture. So in this example, these are the supply chain members. So P&G as a provider for the in-kind donation, and then we had the relief agency. This is something that is very interesting. It's a foundation under the Thai Red Cross, but like in the case of Thailand, it's a royal foundation, so it has a bit more power. And then one of the key stakeholders is, of course, the community leaders. The community leaders, and then we had the modern trade retailers who were part of the P&G's supply chain network. So when you look at this particular picture, one of the biggest challenges initially for P&G is how could they convince the people, especially the community leaders, that the product is usable, it's safe. How could they convince that they are not trying to sell the product afterward, it's not purely for commercial purpose. And in this sense, they were quite shrewd by working with this relief agency, because this relief agency under the Red Cross, headed by one of the princesses, then just took the product and worked with the community leaders. So that means it reduced like the commercial perspective, and it became really more from the perspective of supporting the community, making the community more resilient. And because the community leaders trusted the relief agency, but not P&G, the relief agency became like a kind of a moderator for that specific activity. So what they did was, okay, if you look at the various phases, in the preparation phase, it was all about P&G working with the relief agency so that they could work with the community leaders, both through the agency and then after that, directly. The modern trade retailers, they were involved in the normal commercial practices. But then what happened was, when the flood came in, P&G was already working with the relief agencies, the community leader, but then they could piggyback on the existing network of the modern trade retailers to further distribute the packets. So the community leaders had like an initial inventory, and then when the flood came in, the whole distribution was done through the modern trade retailers, and it was like a good CSR exercise for the modern trade retailers, because they could be seen, yes, we're also helping the community that is around us in terms of delivering these modern packets. And then the reconstruction phase after the flood, again, so it's P&G, the relief agency, and then the community leaders looking at the lessons learned in terms of what they have done and what was successful, what was not successful. So here's just to show you, and you have more detail in the paper itself, you know, what was actually done during the preparedness phase. And I think what is very important is that P&G was in constant discussion with their retailers, modern trade retailers, to tell them about such kind of activities. But really, in the preparedness phase, the real issue was about the training of the local community, the education, and how these volunteers could use these packets, these chemical packets, to good use. Then, when you look at the requirement in the response phase, then the relationship, the collaboration shifted more towards working with the modern trade retailers, with the community leaders, because they have already worked with the foundation. The role of the foundation was a bit less, it was more operational. And then you have the reconstruction phase, where it's really P&G going back and working with the foundation. So this is like the big picture in terms of the whole overall collaboration framework, because you need to look at, you know, what is the type of the disaster, in which phase you are on, and then who is involved in what. But what we've identified when we looked at this specific humanitarian supply chain is that it's true. One of the key success factors is this participatory approach. You need to get everyone involved. You need to be able to respond, trust, very important, and then yes, this supply chain collaboration that needs to come in order to help the affected communities. So, what are the lessons learned from my part from doing this paper? The first thing for me is the scope of collaboration. Yeah, that needs to be clarified, and then we need to work on that. Maybe, you know, establish some sort of levels of collaboration, maybe. Then you have some similar word, and maybe that adds to the confusion. Coordination, cooperation, and I have seen in some papers, they are considered, you know, as an antecedent. Sometimes you see some sort of typology. Oh, you need to have coordination first and then after, but that's not really a mainstream. But for me, I do feel that, you know, trust is very, very important. You need to trust the people you're working with, your partners, and when you trust them, then you can have the commitment. And the commitment is also something that is very important, especially in case of disruption. Because you can trust them, but if you don't commit to work with them or to be on the same boat, then that is an issue. The decision from an operational perspective, yes, they do need to be synchronized. We know how important that is in order to be able to respond faster, but we must not forget, at the end of the day, maybe the humanitarian case is slightly different, but incentive alignment is still something that is very, very important. We don't collaborate because we say, I love the world, I love it, I love kids and I want to collaborate with everyone. No, there needs to be some sort of incentives in it. And information sharing in itself is just a prerequisite, just a starting point for collaboration. And in order to achieve supply chain resilience, when we think into our collaboration, then we need to broaden a horizon and think of the public sector, but also the NGOs, the civil society, and all the other supply chain stakeholders. And I think I've taken a bit too much time, but thank you very much.